I mean, I've been on the streets for a long time, since, in fact, Rodney King protests in Toronto in the 90s, and I'm seeing massive police presence like I have not seen before. When we went out to the Barclay Center in Brooklyn on Friday, there was not just a line, but a small army of police officers who were waiting for us an hour before we got there, none of them wearing masks. And it's just been everywhere we've gone. There have been amazing protests, and then you turn a corner and you're met with a line of militarized police forces. And that's actually what is fueling the protests at this point. I think people are in the streets over the injustice of the horrifying injustice of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade in Tallahassee. And they're being further fueled by the police violence they're experiencing in the context of the protests, and also police violence that continues unabated as the protests go on. There were two police shootings last night, one in New York City and one in Chicago. And so, and then the imposition of curfews in over 40 cities around the country is creating more opportunities for police repression, as we've seen across the country last night, more opportunities for police violence. People are being pulled out of cars, people are being shot with rubber bullets, people are being tear gassed, young girls are being pepper sprayed in the face, and that is further fueling people's frustration. And at this point, it makes no sense to be responding to an uprising that is challenging police violence by creating more opportunities for police violence through militarized responses and an imposition of curfews.
And as you've observed it, that is different from all of your experiences, it was quite an extraordinary statement. What is creating the difference now? What is creating that response that you're seeing and the different atmosphere?
I think it's the political climate that we're in. I think it's the tremendous transfer of military equipment. Over $6 billion worth of military equipment has been transferred to local and state police departments over the past decade, and we can see it. We can see it on the streets. And I think it's also the political climate. I think you have a president who's tweeting that people should be shot. We have a president who this morning tweeted something that suggested he's sending the national military into New York against the wishes of the governor and the mayor and the residents of New York. So I think at this point, and there's also the question of white supremacists who are taking tremendous license in this moment from the political climate, from the implicit authorization of the president and law enforcement at all levels, and wandering the streets of Philadelphia and other towns with bats in Minneapolis, attacking protesters, and in many other places. And so I think the fact that these protests are happening in the context of a pandemic, which makes every police interaction, because police departments have very high rates of infection, a potential moment of transmission. Every arrest, every corralling into a small space on the Manhattan Bridge, thousands of people were stuck on there for an hour last night with no opportunity to wash their hands, no sanitizer. Police often pull down masks to pepper spray you or tear gas you or put you in a cell with many people with no masks. They're using tear gas and pepper spray in the midst of a respiratory pandemic. That also feels, some activists have characterized that as bioterrorism, and that the police at this point are, vectors in a pandemic that we're going to see unfortunate outcomes from that as well. So I think the political climate, the economic climate also, we're in the biggest economic crisis of our lifetimes. People here have gotten one payment if they were in the formal economy. Rent was due on Monday. That's the third month of rent being due, with very little relief for renters and mortgage owners and small businesses. People are in a situation where they're rising up against state violence in the form of police violence, but they're also rising up against state violence in the form of abandonment of Black communities in the midst of a pandemic, and that the response is more police repression, more money in police budgets while we cut funding for healthcare and summer youth programs and the things that people need to survive this pandemic. People are responding to all of that in the streets.
So then I wonder, it's a two-part question, not just when does this end, but how does this end?
I think this ends when officials recognize that more police repression, more police money, more police funding is only going to fuel the uprising, and that they need to address the root causes. They need to respond to the demands of people. People have been through now decades of commissions, investigations, recommendations, policy reforms. The Minneapolis Police Department, on paper, had all the best practices and reforms that people have been advocating for years. And you saw a police officer with impunity kneel on someone's neck for nearly 10 minutes until they stop breathing, and which is clearly not authorized under any of these policies. And so people are tired. They're not. It's not just a question of accountability of one officer or of several officers or of officers in multiple cases. It's a question of dramatic systemic change. And it's a question of recognition that in a pandemic, we need to be dramatically restructuring how we think of public safety and public good, and that does not involve police and repression and militarized responses and curfews. It requires really reallocating our priorities, our resources to the things people need: universal health care, quality, affordable housing, real income support, real mental health support, and the things that at this point are on the chopping block on city budgets across the country in favor of more and more policing and criminalization. More of the same, more of what killed George Floyd, more of what killed Breonna Taylor, more of what killed Tony McDade. And that's unacceptable. And people are not going to stop demanding justice and being in the streets demanding justice until those demands are met. And while they're doing it, they're building and showing systems that we can care for each other. There are street medics out there. There are people feeding families. In Chicago, the mayor stopped the school food program in the middle of the protests, almost as punishment. And people are out there providing food for families in their stead. So we're showing that we can meet our community's needs, and we need the resources to be directed to surviving this pandemic and keeping each other safe, not to institutions and forces that are literally putting our health and life and safety at risk every day, all the time.
It's very interesting. That last point you make is one that we are hearing increasingly from people like yourself right now with this response. I'd like you to put this in a global context, because as we're speaking, Ms. Ritchie, we're looking at live pictures of London. There are thousands of people in Hyde Park, which you perhaps may be aware of. Huge protest. Paris overnight. Australia. We are seeing similar demonstrations across Canada. Yes, in solidarity with George Floyd, but for more. What do you think is the moment globally?
I think the moment globally is that we're seeing the same question that I just pointed out, which is that there's consistent and continuing anti-Black police violence, and the pandemic has also revealed the incredible the deadly impacts of the structural abandonment of Black communities around the world and the continued targeting of state violence. Black communities are being literally sent off to die, forced back to work as essential workers without any protection, without any income support, without means for practicing the things that people of privilege can do, which is to stay home and work from home and stay safe and practice social distancing. People are being literally left to die in prisons and jails of COVID, and officials are refusing, and immigration detention centers like Laval, and officials are simply consigning them to death by refusing to release them. And at this point, people are rising up and saying, we're not going to die. We're not just going to lay down and die. We want a different response to this pandemic. We want a response to this pandemic that prioritizes people over profit, that prioritizes Black lives, that shows by actions that Black lives matter, not by tweets and statements and symbolic performance, but actual policy making that centers and values Black lives globally. And I think that's true in Canada. And I think Justin Trudeau's inability to respond to a simple question yesterday that he should have been prepared for, makes it clear that officials are way behind on being able to center Black lives and ensure that Black life will be able to survive this pandemic and it will not be consigned to death as we have so many times over so many generations throughout slavery. I think that's what you're seeing around the world. And I think anywhere I've been in a global conversation about policing, whether it was Brazil or France or the UK or Ireland, the people who are experiencing that kind of state violence are Black people. And so that's what you're seeing the response around the world.
And can I get you just to have a concluding thought on Canada? You mentioned Canada's Prime Minister. I was going to ask you specifically about the comments from two premiers. Yesterday, Ontario's premier and Quebec's premier saying that there is not a systemic racism issue in Canada, that it's night and day. In Ontario premier's words, night and day when you compare to the racism situation in the the United States. You mentioned being in the Rodney King riots in Toronto. You're born in Montreal, correct? Is that
That's correct.
So you would have an eye for the Canadian situation, and as you see it, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there have been thousands of people demonstrating in this country as well. And I'm wondering what you think the challenge is for Canada's political leaders in terms of addressing this when they're not even speaking to the question of systemic racism, as you have.
Absolutely, and I would just characterize the uprisings around Rodney King in Toronto as such, and as a recognition that what was happening in the U.S. is happening in Canada. And I think that Canadian politicians need to stop looking south of the border, pointing fingers as if it's not happening in Toronto. We're living the same things in Toronto and Montreal. I've, organized around police shootings, police killings in Montreal and Toronto, and many of my comrades are, including Beverly Bain, who you heard from this morning, and Black Lives Matter chapters in Toronto and across the country. Police violence against Black people, carding, which is the same as stop and frisk in New York City, is happening in Toronto and Montreal and elsewhere. Police violence against Indigenous people. You just showed video of incredible police violence against Indigenous people. Indigenous women are experiencing widespread sexual violence by police. There's just so much I can tell you about police violence in Canada that looks very similar to what we're seeing here, and there's this sort of willful ignorance or willful inability to look at what that's, or unwillingness to look at what that looks like in Canada that absolutely needs to stop and absolutely needs to be addressed. And the systemic racism that persists in policing and also in response to the pandemic needs to be surfaced and confronted by Canadian politicians. They can't keep pointing south of the border.